Give me 2 seconds. Okay, you're good.
Okay, so welcome everybody to another webinar in the evolution of science fiction, brought to you by the Center for Future Consciousness. And today we are up to module 13 in the series. I'll have a slide up that in a moment. The entire science fiction series is drawn from my series of books on science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future. And right now we're up to book 4, volume 4, and chapters 3 and 4 within that series. Now, as I mentioned before, volumes 2 and 3 are finished, and I'm in the process of getting them published right now. And volume 4 is being written. In fact, as I was researching this module, module 13, the Silver Age, it became increasingly apparent to me that there was just such an incredible amount of good stuff to cover that there was no way on God's earth we were going to cover this period in a 1-2 hour webinar. So as a surprise for you, module 13, the Silver Age, 1950 to 1965, I'm going to have 2 consecutive webinars on this. In 2 weeks, we will complete this, and the one that we do in 2 weeks will be free for everybody because there's just too much to cover in 2 hours. It's such a rich period of authors, novels, films, etc. And in fact, up here we have a very famous image from Galaxy magazine, which came on the scene during the Silver Age, began I think in 1949 or 1950. And it's the cover for the issue in which The Ballad of Lost Camel by Cornwainer Smith appeared. And that's Camel on the cover, and Camel was a cat woman, or as Smith referred to her, a girly girl of the far distant future. In fact, I think 15,000 AD. And this is a very famous story that we'll eventually come to in the webinar, probably toward the end of this one or the beginning of the next one. I take the expression the Silver Age from John Clute, who is one of the creators of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction. And he used the expression the Silver Age to refer to the period of 1950 to 1965, roughly. And I should, though, note in beginning a couple things about the Silver Age. In my humble opinion, the quality of science fiction, the variety and number of excellent works that were produced during this period exceeded what was produced during the Golden Age. So if one wanted to talk about a peak of science fiction creativity and quality, the Silver Age, in my mind, is at least equal to, if not superior, to what people generally refer to as the Golden Age, is what we were talking about last time, the period of 1938 to 1950. Part of the reason why that it's going to be 4 hours is because there's so much good stuff that was done during this 15 years. And Cornwainer Smith, who was a very interesting character, who will come to in the webinar, is one among many significant writers who emerged during this time and produced a number of very noteworthy novels and noteworthy stories primarily. I have a friend, as we move into this, I should mention this off the bat. I have a friend, Don Sanborn, who's a retired philosophy professor in the Chicago metro area, who was an avid science fiction fan when he was young. And he got in touch with me one day and brought up to me the idea that if I was Willie, he had a giant science fiction library that his wife told him was taking up too much room in the house and he needed to get rid of, but he wanted to give it to somebody who would take care of it. And so I said, of course I'll take care of it. And he drove out from Chicago with, I think, 15 or 20 boxes of books and magazines and literally gave me the whole collection, which was a surprise to Jeannie at the time. But there was lots of interesting things in the collection he gave me, including probably 200 copies of Galaxy magazine from the 1950s and 60s. And this cover indeed is, as I mentioned, very famous. And here's the original right here. This is one of the many, many Galaxy magazines that Don had given me. And so I have a couple of others I'll show you as we move along. But the Silver Age was a time of great creativity, lots of really good writers, lots of films that were produced during that time, and covers the period of roughly 1950 to 1965. And just to remind ourselves, last time I talked about the Golden Age, and there's that picture, which actually, a painting I really like by Michael Wheeling of the mule from Asimov's The Foundation trilogy, which turned into more than a trilogy eventually. And we talked about John Campbell and Astounding Science Fiction Magazine, and Heinlein and Asimov and Van Vogt, and the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and the growing tension and challenge of World War II, and the dystopias that were written during that period, such as Swastika Night, 1984, and C.S. Lewis and his Christian science fiction. And I ended it up with Clifford Simak's City and George Stewart's Earth Abides. So that brought us up to just around 1950 last time. And one comment to make about the Golden Age, at least to reinforce it, is that a lot of science fiction writers during that time consciously responded to the global challenges, political and social, that humanity faced back in the 1940s by seeing science fiction as a way to articulate a constructive and positive response to those challenges. That is, science fiction in the hands of Campbell and Heinlein and Van Vogt and others was stimulated and provoked into a level of creativity by having to think through and deal with, well, where is humanity going given the situation we're in? And there were bleak visions at that time, like 1984, right after the war, and Swastika Night, which was written right before the war. But there was a constructive attitude among science fiction writers of how do we envision a rational, competent humanity using technology and enlightened ideals to address the challenges and the darkness that was facing us during the 1940s. And I bring that up because when we go into the 1950s, we're going to see again that there is a significant connection between science fiction and what's going on in the world. So, as I mentioned, and that's a painting up there by the father of space art, a very famous painting of Saturn viewed from Titan by Chesley Bonestell. And he is one of the significant artists who I'll talk about and cover in this period of the 1950s, early 1960s. As we'll see, the 1950s and early 1960s is just chock full of stuff. In the next 4 hours, today and 2 weeks from today, we're going to go through all of this, from the social, technological, scientific context that science fiction developed in, the evolution of science fiction through more magazines, the introduction of paperbacks, fandom. Then we're going to get into the first great writer of the Silver Age, Alfred Bester. And then we'll talk about science fiction films and science fiction on TV and science fiction art and science fiction comics. And then we'll get into writers, beginning with some writers who were writing even before the Silver Age. And we'll do part 2 on Heinlein, Asimov, and introduce Fritz Leiber and Theodore Sturgeon, who were great writers of the time, and go back to Clifford Simak again. Then we'll get into other writers who made their name primarily during the Silver Age, like Ray Bradbury and Cornwater Smith and Frederick Pohl, and then Arthur C. Clarke, who people are probably familiar with, and one of the great science fiction writers of the 50s and 60s, Poul Anderson, and then Stanislaus Lem, and then highlighting a few novels by Moore, Sheckley, and Clement. Then we'll talk about Flowers for Algernon and Dune as we come to the end of the period being covered. And then we'll talk about the end of modern civilization, which is kind of like the cap on this period. And the great novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, and visions of the end of humanity, of which there were many written during this period. And we'll close out with Philip Dick, who emerges in the late 50s or middle 50s, actually, and into the 60s and 70s. And Philip Dick is like the bridge stylistically and conceptually between the Silver Age and the age to follow, the new wave. And people are probably to some degree familiar with Philip Dick insofar as a number of his novels have been made into movies and or TV series as well. So we'll end with Philip Dick in the 60s and into the 70s, because he is, in my mind, a definite bridge between what was going on in the 50s and 60s and what went on into the 70s. So that's a lot we'll be covering, and that's why we're doing it over 2 webinars. Now, let's set the context to begin with for science fiction in the 50s and early 60s. And up here I have an image of Sputnik, which I remember the day that Sputnik first transversed the sky. And we all went out in 1957 to look at this little light that was moving across the night sky. The 1950s brought with it the acceleration of the power of nuclear bombs, from the atom bomb to the hydrogen bomb, and the possibility of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union becoming increasingly more ominous and threatening, where people started to build underground places to go hide from, shelters, underground shelters. The whole 1940s saw the Cold War, this political and philosophical and social battle between communism versus capitalism. That was in a lot of people's minds during that time too. So there's a military tension. There's a technological competition going on. The space race starts to heat up. We had Sputnik. We had lots of other satellites going on. So during the 1950s, which is often portrayed as an idyllic period when Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States and people were moving into and creating the suburbs, there was a lot of social and political tension. And there was the threat of worldwide global war, annihilation. We saw the flying saucer craze emerge during that time, when people started to see more and more unidentified flying objects, actually toward the latter part of the 1940s. Science fiction cinema really took off in the 1950s. Radio continued, but a new form of multimedia entertainment took hold on first the United States and spreading across a lot of the rest of the world, television. And television became the dominant visual form of entertainment during the middle to late 1960s. And while all this is going on, while the tension is going on, I've already introduced this, we have increasing consumerism, increasing prosperity. I remember watching cars slowly turn into looking like rocket ships as we moved toward the end of the 1950s with giant fins, very techno-enthusiastic. And we have critiques of this very consumerism and prosperity. We have a counterculture which begins to clearly emerge in the 1950s with the youth rock and roll generation and music of a different kind coming in with Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Bill Haley and the Comets. We have a pop culture generation, something different from before. And we see the emergence of the beats and the beatniks. So there's a counter reaction to the affluence that the United States and a lot of the rest of the West is experiencing, that there's something wrong with the kind of Western way of life. Lots of critical books and essays written on that. And but then there's a counter, which is that the hippies have lost, not the hippies, at least to begin with, the beats and the beatniks seem to be showing a decline in morality and character. What happened to the tough characters of the 1940s who earned their way through life? And now we have a lot of pampered people in the West, youth in the West, who can't seem to appreciate the value of hard work because they have so much given to them. Now, all of these different factors, social and technologically, are going to play into and influence different works in science fiction in different types of ways. And a question that often comes up about science fiction, which is how well does science fiction predict the future? And the line of causality there goes from, here we have people writing science fiction, to what are they saying about the future of human society, about human technology? It's important in thinking about the Silver Age to flip the causality line over and ask instead, what is going on in our present reality, the 1950s and early 60s, which is influencing what gets written in science fiction? That is, in that case, science fiction isn't anticipating the future, but is rather reflecting the present and reflecting trends that writers see in the present. And as I mentioned, almost all of these different, I said all of them, trends and themes of the 50s and 60s pop up in different ways in the science fiction that gets written during the 1950s and 60s, where people imagine, for example, the obvious one is if the USA and the Soviet Union have this great stockpile of nuclear weapons and we ever went into a third world war, that would be probably the end of modern civilization. And how many science fiction novels were written with that theme? Plenty. In fact, I would suggest to you that the most significant and moving and masterful science fiction novel of the Silver Age dealt with the aftermath of World War III. Now, that's a very bleak image to come out of an era that people were making more money, were buying better cars, were living in their own houses, were involved in more pop culture, more consumerism and all of that. But in fact, by the time we go through the 1950s into the early 60s, there were a lot of novels written about World War III. And I think the best novel of that 15-year period was The Aftermath of World War III. And you could probably guess which one I think it is. But we'll come to that eventually. So, a marker for the beginning of the Silver Age, I take as the fact that Campbell had dominated American and British science fiction with his magazine Astounding in the 1940s. When we get to the beginning of the 1950s, a whole slew of new science fiction magazines come on the scene. And up here, I have images of a number of magazines that began publication back in the late 1940s. New Worlds actually started in 1946 in Great Britain, but most of the other ones, in fact, all the other ones up here started in 1950 or soon thereafter. The two new magazines in particular, which ended up being the strongest competition to Campbell's Astounding, were Fantasy and Science Fiction and Galaxy magazines. Those two began in the very early part of the 1950s. And we had new editors for these different magazines, different than Campbell. And so we got this increasing diversity of stories coming out of science fiction magazines, no longer simply dominated by Astounding and by Campbell. And it's not like Campbell didn't keep publishing Astounding through the 1950s, but we had a number of other ones. I already showed you a picture of Galaxy, the cover that had the Battle of Lost Camel inside, and Fantasy and Science Fiction started to produce a lot of quality stories too. In fact, Galaxy started to try to emphasize more social science fiction. And between Fantasy and Science Fiction and Galaxy, we got a lot more in the way of stories that dealt with psychological and social aspects of science fiction writing. And then we had this whole huge plurality of other magazines too. So one way in which science fiction in the 50s jumps ahead of the 1940s is this incredible proliferation of new magazines. And a lot of the stories that turned into novels in the 50s were first published as serials in the 1950s in these magazines. Up here, there are the covers from Galaxy when the Demolished Man first appeared as a serial or series in there. And up here we have the cover from Fantasy and Science Fiction for Flowers for Algernon, which came out toward the latter part of the 1950s. So lots of the great novels that were written during this time were first published in these new magazines, of which there are many. On the right-hand side, you can see, I think you should be able to see, that eventually Campbell changed the name of Astounding to Analog, and that came in 1960. And no longer was it saying Astounding, he wanted to change the name to Analog. So that was a revitalized a version of his magazine, Astounding. Fortunately, Don, my friend from the Chicago metro area, aside from giving me lots of Galaxies from the 50s and 60s, also gave me lots of Astounding from the 50s and 60s. And so one thing I should note is that all these other magazines are coming in. It isn't like Astounding wasn't still producing quality stuff in the 1950s. And so in the 1950s in Astounding, we also get a lot of series that are produced that turn into novels as well that become very famous. So we just have a much bigger variety of magazines to choose from. Now, something else happens in the 1950s, which is the emergence of paperbacks as a very popular format for science fiction. And paperbacks is a more modern phenomena than the hardcover. And I just want to highlight one phenomena that happened in the 1950s with paperbacks, is that Ace Publishing Company decided to do this inventive thing of publishing a series of science fiction novels where you had two novels in each bound copy. And if you flip the novel over one way, you had a cover for that novel, and you read through half of the volume. And then when you got to the middle of the volume, you got to what was actually the end of the novel on the reverse side, which you had to flip over and read from the other end of the book. And they produced upwards of 200 of these, at least, maybe more. And I have up here just some images of some of the double covers, double volumes that Ace produced during the time. And I put it up here because I want to highlight that in the 1950s, we get this immense increase in the number of science fiction novels being published, and in particular, published as paperbacks. Now, novels were published before in the 40s and earlier as hardcovers, but nowhere near the number that were produced during the 1950s. So in terms of quantity of publications, the 1950s just went way beyond the 1940s in terms of the number of novels that were published. And Ace is a good example of how we had a huge array of different novels published during that time as marketable novels that you could actually, marketable books, you could actually read 2 novels for the price of 1. By the way, notice up there, if you could see it closely enough, at the beginning, the Ace double novels were 35 cents. So you got 2 novels for 35 cents. Don brought me about 100 of these, and it's a fascinating group of novels to look through. Lots of them, who the hell remembers them? But it was definitely this explosion of production and creativity in paperback novels. Now, it was during the 1950s, toward the end of the 1940s, that another phenomena begins to emerge in science fiction. In I think it's 1949, yeah, that's the first one, 1949, Everett Blyer and a second gentleman named Dickey began publishing anthologies of the best of science fiction stories of the previous year. Now, up to then, no one had done this. And after Blyer and Dickey started doing it, a lot of other people over the next decades jumped on this bandwagon, so that not only you could have more magazines to choose from, kind of overloading yourself, but then we had science fiction scholars and readers emerging who would collect together what they thought was the best stuff of the year and would publish it so you could see what would be considered to be the best stories of the year. And other people started to collect together classic stories and publish them, like the Spectrum series with Amos and Conquest during the 1950s, and the year's greatest science fiction and fantasy by Judith Merrill, which she produced, I think, for about 20 years running, beginning in the 1950s. And Conklin was another anthologist who produced a whole series of different collections of science fiction stories, pulling together stories that centered around different themes like possible worlds or thinking machines or aliens or whatever. And one science fiction fan, historian, popularizer, Sam Moskowitz, started to publish in the 1950s and into the 60s critical works on science fiction and science fiction writers. So we begin to get science fiction scholarship during the 1950s as well, too. So we're getting collections of the best, and that's gone up to the present. We're getting all these new anthologies where people collect together stories and publish them in paperback form. We're getting studies of science fiction, and we're getting certain people who are emerging here as being contemplative and overseers of the phenomena and the lay of the land of science fiction and what's being produced that is good stuff, and putting it together into manageable paperback collections for you to look at. And this is a new phenomena that comes on the scene in the 1950s. So you can see that science fiction is proliferating, more diversity in it, many more books, and people are becoming more self-conscious of it, are collecting the good stuff together, and are actually beginning to write and think about it. Of course, Gernsback back in the 1920s and 30s started the whole thing going with his first series of editorials and commentaries on the history of science fiction. But now by the time you get up to the 1950s, it's becoming increasingly more of a focus among writers to think about what science fiction is, how did it get to where it is, what's the best stuff going on in it, and where do we see it going in the future. And in fact, The Immortal Storm by Moskowitz is a history of science fiction fandom now. So now they're thinking about, well, how is science fiction fandom evolving through the decades? Now, another element of the 1950s of significance of the Silver Age is that science fiction world conventions had been going on since the late 1930s. I think 39 was the first one. But in 1953 at the World Science Fiction Convention, for the first time, the participants of the convention gave out awards. And the awards were named after Hugo Gernsback. And the awards were called the Hugos. And this was the first year that fans and writers of science fiction voted on what were the best products of science fiction of that year. So that year, a novel won as best science fiction novel of the year. Another one won as best short story of the year. Another award was given out to artists. So science fiction became more self-conscious in that now it was beginning to think about what's the best that was produced, and let's vote on that, and let's come to decisions on who should get the awards for each year for the best products of science fiction. At the end of the Silver Age in 1965, the science fiction writers science fiction fantasy writers of America began to give out the Nebula Awards. And the Nebulas are voted only by the members of the science fiction writers, science fiction and fantasy writers of America. So we had now a second world award given out along with the Hugos, sort of as markers here. So this is another way in which science fiction in the 50s became more self-conscious, began to honor its accomplishments, and began to create a historical record of what the best things were, voted on by fans and voted on by writers of the previous year. And in fact, eventually, the World Science Fiction Convention now does retro Hugos, where they go back and give awards of Hugos for books and stories that were published before 1953, so that earlier stuff does get acknowledged, whether it has to do with stories or novels. Now, the first novel to win Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year was The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And The Demolished Man was a very powerful and highly regarded science fiction novel that lots of people will put on their top 10 or top 20 list of all-time greatest science fiction novels. So the Hugos start off with a bang. The Demolished Man was a trip, a mental trip, a very action-packed, colorful novel, and it won the Hugo for Best Novel of the Year. The first novel to win the Nebula toward the end of this period of the Silver Age was Frank Herbert's Dune. And that's one good marker for the end of the Silver Age is Dune. So awards come on the scene. Anthologies come on the scene. Histories are being written. That comes on the scene too. And so a good place to begin, a good person to highlight here as a critical, significant writer of this early part of the Silver Age is indeed Alfred Bester. I have up here a quote. Now, this quote doesn't come from The Demolished Man. This quote comes from Finally Fahrenheit, which was a story that Bester wrote in the early 1950s, and it's included in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. But I always thought this was a great quote, and I'll tell you why after I read it, but I'm just going to read it for you. He doesn't know which of us I am these days, but they know one truth. You must own nothing but yourself. You must make your own life, live your own life, and die your own death, or else you will die another's. Now, that's the opening of Finally Fahrenheit. And if you try to parse out that introduction in terms of what's being said, you'll notice that the question of personal identity is ambiguous in there. He doesn't know which of us I am these days. What the hell does that mean? And it's actually written by an android. And the story, Finally Fahrenheit, is about a man who has ownership of an android. But the problem is when the android gets near hot temperatures, the android loses control of itself and murders people. And it's a study in psychopathology, which Bester was great at creating crazy people. Really, in this case here, a crazy android. But the owner's crazy too, because the owner loses his sense of who he is versus the android. That is, there is this blending, this ambiguity of the android and the owner in the mind of the owner. The sense of personal identity begins to evaporate because the android is the servant of the owner and the android has gone mad. Bester brings into science fiction in the early 1950s excellent stories about psychopathology. And that's part of what makes for the significance of his work. I had already mentioned The Demolished Man, which won the Hugo that first year that the Hugos were awarded. And The Demolished Man takes place roughly about 500 years in the future, in which many, many people have acquired telepathic powers, can read other people's minds. And we have an extremely rich individual who's in competition with this other extremely rich businessman and decides that he wants to murder him. But given the fact that the police can read people's minds, he has to concoct a perfect crime where whatever is going to happen here, he somehow is going to be able to get off without being caught, even though when he gets questioned on this by a telepathic policeman, the telepathic policeman is going to be able to read his mind and read his memories. And the first twist that comes off in this novel is that, surprisingly, it turns out that the man who commits the murder, the person he kills, unbeknownst to him, is his father. And unbeknownst to him, the murder is witnessed by his half-sister. And the head of the telepathic police, the Espers, he is a very interesting and intelligent character who notices right off the bat and realizes right off the bat who the murderer is here of this crime, and eventually proves that the gentleman, the demolished man, is indeed the murderer of this other gentleman who turned out to be his father. And a thing that Bester does in the novel, which is a real psychological accomplishment, is that he writes dialogue that you can follow, where you have multiple minds, all of them reading each other's minds, communicating with each other. It is a very colorful and dramatic and crazy novel. And it definitely deserved winning Best Novel of the Year. In fact, as I mentioned, lots of people think The Demolished Man is one of the 10 or 20 best science fiction novels ever written. And if you haven't read it, I would definitely recommend reading it, because it's a great introduction to Alfred Bester, because Alfred Bester had a style of writing that was extremely colorful, dynamic, energetic, and would draw you in to his madnesses that he would attempt to portray in his novels. And this one is in the 21st century and regarding telepathy and an extremely interesting telepathic chief of police who tracks down this murderer. A couple years later, Bester writes a second great novel of the 1950s, Tiger, Tiger, or alternatively titled The Star Is My Destination. Now, keep in mind, this is a significant accomplishment because often people will list The Star Is My Destination as one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written. So Bester, in a period of 2 or 3 years, writes 2 of the classics of science fiction. And Tiger, Tiger is about a gentleman, okay, we're up to the 25th century again. And in the 21st century, people could move their bodies around simply by mentally willing it. It's called jaunting. And we have a gentleman who is on a spaceship, who is shipwrecked, and his company won't even pick him up. And he gets picked up by a bunch of space hippies who go through a mystical religious ceremony with him and tattoo his whole face with tiger stripes. And eventually, our main character gets free and goes on this journey that is motivated by revenge to find the people who left him abandoned in outer space. And he actually goes into some kind of physical surgery where the stripes on his face are removed, but anytime he gets angry or emotionally charged up, the stripes come back. So we have a very fascinating character here who has stripes on his face that come out whenever he's charged up, whenever he's erotic, whenever he's angry. And he tries to track down who abandoned him. But along the way, he falls in love with a woman, and he eventually realizes or discovers that the person who abandoned him in outer space is this woman who he's fallen in love with. We have psychopathology again. In fact, those who are familiar with Western literature, this novel, to a great degree, is modeled on The Count of Monte Cristo, because our main character gets thrown in jail. He learns how to become an efficient fighter. He has all of these adventures, and he gets out and he tries to track down those people who have harmed him. And the ending of it is very interesting because he eventually learns how to move his body through outer space, which no one was ever able to do before. But it's a second really very colorful study of madness. If you don't happen to know, Bester titled this after the opening lines of a poem by Blake, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry." And so it's inspired off of that poem, the title, and it's modeled off of the Count of Monte Cristo, and it's another study in this case here, a man obsessed with revenge of killing those who abandoned him in space. So Bester brings in, and not that science fiction writers hadn't done this before, Bester brings in human psychology, and in particular psychopathology, into his novels. And he creates these very colorful future worlds in which these mad characters go on these various rampages, murdering and trying to hide their murders and trying to kill other people. So it has this very action-packed element to it. And lots of people would see Bester as an antecedent both of the new wave of science fiction, which is to come in the 60s, as well as anticipative even of cyberpunk. There's lots of elements of cyberpunk that you could see in Bester's works. But in the early 50s, two of the best science fiction novels ever written, he wrote them right there, boom, right off the bat. And if you haven't read one or the other of them, everybody will tell you who knows anything about science fiction, read those two novels. And so the Silver Age begins with a bang. It begins in terms of its new novels and significant new writers, Alfred Bester and The Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination. Now, as I mentioned to Thierry, this webinar is the first webinar where members of the audience among us are going to remember things from this period. Those of us who were born in the 1940s, we grew up in the 50s and the early 60s. And one thing that we all remember, whether we were reading science fiction at the time as a youth, that we all remember from then, is what happens in the movies in the 1950s. Because in the movies, science fiction explodes on the screen. There was not very much interesting science fiction cinema produced in the 1940s, not that much. In the 1950s, there were 200 science fiction films produced. And if you were a young, a youth of the time, you went to see a lot of these. Now, I have images up here of actually 11, if you include the War of the Worlds on the behind background. But early in the 1950s, George Pal, together with Chesley Bonestell doing the artwork, produced a significant early science fiction movie, Destination Moon, that was based on a story by Robert Heinlein. And that has a good scientific bent to it, although it's sort of a little boring when it comes to all of the great terrifying adventures that were produced in the 1940s in film. But also during that time, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was produced about a giant reptile which wreaks havoc in our modern world. And this was inspired by a story by Ray Bradbury, but also the animation of the giant creature in here was done by Ray Harryhausen, who would turn into a significant figure in special effects in both science fiction and fantasy during the 50s and 60s. And Ray Harryhausen was mentored by Louis O'Brien, who is the gentleman who created King Kong. One of the most famous movies of the 50s, The Day the Earth Stood Still, which was based on Harry Bates' Farewell to the Master, was produced during that time with the giant robot and the aliens coming to Earth and warning us that we better stop being so warlike or else they're gonna blow us up. Now, there we have a first indication of what's going on in the world influencing what gets created in science fiction. Now, Farewell to the Master was originally written in the Golden Age. The movie was produced The Day the Earth Stood Still during the Cold War. And it had the feeling of the Cold War, in that humanity is threatening its own extinction. We're getting too aggressive, too technologically powerful. And the aliens are going to warn us that we better cool our jets or else they're going to blow us up. And we had other significant movies that I'm sure lots of people in the audience have watched, like the Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which Ray Harryhausen also did the special effects for. Invaders from Mars, which was one of a series of movies produced about aliens invading us. And Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the same thing. And the thing to keep in mind about the alien invading us movies is the alien invading us movies, various interpreters of science fiction will often say are metaphors of getting invaded by the Russians. That what we have here is we have a nemesis that's coming and is going to invade and destroy us. And the same thing with the thing from another world. And then we also get the dangers of nuclear testing and nuclear energy, like in them, where we have giant mutated ants due to us losing control over the effects of our nuclear experimentation and nature getting perverted and upset due to it. So there's warnings. And when worlds collide, we have the film version of the famous disaster movie of the 1930s that I talked about back a few webinars ago. These are just 10 up there on the screen. And like I said, there was 200 produced. There may be a lot of other favorites that come to your mind that are not up there. Let's just see what ones. This Island Earth is a favorite of a lot of people. The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Tarantula, It Came from Beneath the Sea, and 20 Million Miles to Earth, which was another one that Ray Harryhausen did the special effects for. In that case, we had a creature from Venus being brought back to the Earth, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Then we had the Amazing Colossal Man and the Incredible Shrinking Man. We had the Blob and the Fly, where horror gets mixed together with science fiction. We have a lot of that going on. And the Angry Red Planet, which some of you may have seen, which is a very bizarre kind of psychedelic science fiction movie about going to Mars. And of course, I had already talked before about the War of the Worlds, which I thought was definitely one of the best science fiction movies of the era. Now, when people talk about their reactions to science fiction or their feelings about science fiction, the thing to consider is a lot of people will base it on science fiction film as opposed to having read a lot of science fiction. And science fiction film would come to dominate public consciousness in terms of what science fiction is all about. So when people say, I don't like science fiction, they usually will bring up movies. It was during the 1950s that science fiction really moved into the cinema and began to produce these visually powerful and often intense and disastrous types of stories and scenarios. And so people, when they think of science fiction, they think of things like the War of the Worlds or Invasion of the Body Snatchers or Earth versus the Flying Saucer, or more recently, Independence Day or Star Wars. We got lots of great special effects, and we have lots of action, we have lots of explosions, and often the Earth's getting attacked, the United States is getting attacked, and lots of things are blowing up. And later on, we're gonna have lots of robots coming in, although we do have a robot in the day the Earth stood still. And aliens often turn out to be horrendous beings who are just trying to conquer and control us or invade our bodies or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so that's the kind of image we get of science fiction in popular culture, and a lot of it comes out of the movies. But in fact, the ability to start to create visually powerful science fiction goes back here to the 1950s and these early examples of it. And these are the examples that I grew up on. This is my first experience in science fiction. I got in love with science fiction by watching science fiction movies in the 50s. And so did a lot of other people. They eventually got around to reading it, but the movies came first. And movies have continued to capture public consciousness up through our present day science fiction movies. I would suggest, though, even though it clearly does not suffer for lack of special effects, that the best science fiction, oh, excuse me, I forgot this. All right, I forgot to mention Godzilla, because Godzilla started in the 1950s too. But Godzilla started in Japan and then was made into an English version of it. And the interesting thing about Godzilla was that here we had the warning of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing having a bad impact upon nature and creating this hideous monster who wreaks havoc on Tokyo, although it could also be seen metaphorically as the destruction of Japan by nuclear weapons by the United States in World War II. It was the Japanese that produced this terrible destruction of Japanese cities, because in fact, Godzilla, the first one, which comes out in 1956, Godzilla King of the Monsters, is only one of 25 or 26 now sequels, because this year we had a new one come out with Godzilla versus King Kong, which is the second time they've done Godzilla versus King Kong. But Godzilla has turned into a phenomena. It's turned into this ongoing series of stories of monsters attacking humans, monsters fighting against other monsters, and somehow connections are made back to nuclear energy, and somehow this whole thing got out of hand, and various other creatures. There's a whole Godzilla universe of Rodan and Mothra and Ghidra and all the other creatures that come with the Godzilla universe. And so you have all these big monsters walking around. And in case Japan put men inside of costumes, Ray Harryhausen at least did Dynamation for his monsters, where he didn't have men inside of costumes. Okay, I forgot to mention that I was going to say something about Godzilla, but Godzilla just goes to show, in this case here, the pervasiveness of science fiction and science fiction cinema, not just in the United States, but in throughout the globe, because the Japanese have produced this immense series of stories of this big giant monster, and people think of that as part of science fiction too. But as I was going to say, the movie produced in the 50s, which I thought was the best science fiction movie of the decade, and lots of people will list this as one of the best science fiction movies ever made, was Forbidden Planet. Now, some of you have probably seen this, and some of you may not have seen this. If you haven't seen Forbidden Planet, I would definitely recommend seeing it. Forbidden Planet takes place in the distant future, and Forbidden Planet involves a spaceship from the Earth that is sent to this planet in another solar system, where 20 years ago, a exploratory party had been sent out, and they came to see if any of this members of this exploratory party were still alive. And what they do is they find a father and a daughter, played by Walter Pidgeon and Anne Francis. And they're the only two left, the only two surviving members left. Now, there's various reasons why I think this is such an excellent movie. Number one is that it has a deep philosophical message to it, which is that if one possesses infinite power to create whatever you want through simply wishing it, perhaps that's not a good thing. Because what the visitors from the Earth discover is that on this planet long ago existed a race of super ethical, super intelligent aliens called the Krell. And the Krell had created a giant machine that laced through their entire planet that allowed them to materialize by simply wishing it any thought or desire that they wanted. And when the machine was turned on, in almost a day, an instant, a quick flash of time, the Krell were entirely annihilated. And the human visitors, led by, in this case, Leslie Nielsen and his associates, eventually discover what happened, which Walter Pidgeon Mobius refuses to admit, that because the Krell have a basic animal biological core, an id, that is uncontrolled by values and by ethics, that down deep, we are all, including the Krell, murderous beasts. When the Krell turned the machine on, the Krell unconscious wreaked havoc on itself, and they all murdered each other. That is, the id of all the Krell came out and self-annihilated. The movie is often seen as similar in a lot of ways to the plot in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And an interesting element in the movie is that they attempt to visualize a monster of the id. In fact, it's a monster of Walter Pidgeon's id. And it becomes visual in the outline of the rays of energy that are hitting it, while the humans attempt to defend themselves against this two-legged creature whose head sort of looks like a lion. But the humans also go down into the interior of the planet, and there's great special effects in it. And we have the very famous Robbie the Robot, which emerges in this. And so we have a lot of different elements that go into it. And in some ways it's campy, in some ways it's sort of slow paced, but in a lot of ways it's very philosophically elevating. And the vision of this super advanced being that destroys itself is fascinating, although a bit ridiculous, because if they're smart, they should have realized their ids were going to kill each other. We have this notion of this question of how one is ever going to be able to control the types of technologies that we could create. In this case here, a technology which allows us to basically do any damn thing we want to do, and could backfire on us in the end. You know, absolute power. And the Crow presumably were super wise. So that takes us up. Yeah. Well, just let me mention one other one here. I'm going to go one step further. I just want to put him up because Ray Harryhausen in the 1950s into the 1960s created this immense variety of dynamation monsters and characters for both fantasy and for science fiction. And in fact, on the fantasy end, you should also probably, a lot of you probably remember 1 million years BC and Jason and the Argonauts. Let me see, what else did he do? The First Men in the Moon, the Valley of Guanji, the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and the skeletons who fight with each other, sword fight. And I already had mentioned 20 Million Miles to Earth and the Beast of 20,000 Phantoms. So what Ray Harryhausen did was the same thing Willis O'Brien did, was he created very detailed models. And then he would shoot one shot of them still, and then slightly move the body, and then shoot a second shot. And so he would create this effect of moving strange creatures that he was filming in what he called dynamation. And so Ray Harryhausen is considered to be like the next big significant figure in the development of special effects. When we get to computers, the kind of thing he did no longer is needed. But if you go back and you look at a lot of his movies and the creatures he created in them, they're very, very fascinating, even if they're a bit jerky in how they move around. And they're very, very imaginative. So that's a point to stop at right now. I think Harryhausen. Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, during the 1950s, as a very powerful social pop cultural phenomena, TV came on the scene. I mean, TV was around before the 1950s, but not that many people had TVs. But in 1950s, people started to buy TVs, and TV turned into probably the dominant multimedia form of entertainment in American culture, at least in the 1950s. And science fiction was there in the TV as well as in the movies. So that's where we're going to go next, which is the emergence and evolution of science fiction on TV. And there's an early TV I have up there. I forget when that TV was created, made, probably back in the 40s. Now, one thing about science fiction on TV is that at first it catered to people like me as I was in the 1950s. That is a young male viewer of 5 to 10 years of age. And the first stuff that was on TV that was science fiction was juvenile. Now, some of this stuff you may remember if you're as old as I am, but in the early 1950s, we had Captain Video and his Video Rangers, and Tom Corbett's Space Cadet. And I remember watching Captain Video. It must have been 5 or 6 years old. And if you watch the shows now, and some of them are up on YouTube, they're very, very campy and very low on special effects and very simple plots. But what begins to happen with these early TV productions, now these are kind of like the antecedents to Star Trek. I mean, 15 years later, this is where we first start going out into outer space on TV. With Tom Corbett, a space cadet, you begin to see the commercialization of science fiction that emerges on TV. And so you can, with Tom Corbett, become a member, a space cadet member, and you could buy toys and get badges, and there's comic books and there's comic strips, and it goes on the radio as well too. So just like later on, we'll see where George Lucas really commercializes science fiction. Even in the 1950s, with the earliest science fiction on TV, it gets commercialized and it targets the young male viewer. The plots do this action, good guys, bad guys, outer space. And Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, and Captain Video and his Video Rangers, in ways have a primitive resonance with Edmund Hamilton and the Interstellar Patrol, and with Doc Smith and the Lensman, because we have these heroic figures who are protecting our planet against bad guys, in particular when we come up to Space Patrol, which takes place presumably in the 30th century. And Space Patrol is another one, and this is 1950, 1955, that's catering to the young male viewer. At that time, I was 3 to 8. And again, you can go ahead and get a membership to the Space Patrol, and you could buy various toys. And we have these heroic, simplistic characters who are out there in space facing challenges and fighting evil beings, aliens, in fact, sometimes. And some of these you could watch, I believe, on YouTube as well, too. So the first three that pop up in the early 1950s on TV are all basically about the same kind of theme, the same kind of dramas going on, the same kinds of characters, and low on special effects, but adventure, action, and we're going out into outer space, and you can come along vicariously with us. I just want to mention that this phenomena of being a member in some science fiction oriented theme or activity, it goes back to Hugo Gernsback again, when he was marketing becoming a member of the Science Fiction League, where, if I recall correctly, you could get a badge for that too. So science fiction was always in the business of marketing. And so in this case here, we have science fiction early on TV entering into engaging with the phenomena of commercialization. And science fiction is going to talk about commercialization, but science fiction is clearly impacted by the phenomena of commercialization, because not only do they attempt to entertain you, they attempt to sell you products associated with that a show, with that theme, with those characters. And that's gone on all the way up to the present. So obviously, if you go into stores today, you'll still find lots of science fiction characters and spaceships, etc. there. But this phenomena goes back like almost 100 years. But in the 1950s, it got connected up with TV productions. Science fiction, though, on TV gets a little more serious as we move along. And we have three significant science fiction television series that emerge a bit later on. I was, 8, 9 years old at the time, but I do remember watching science fiction theater. And maybe Tim or Gerald or Leslie remembers it too. But that was a more serious take on the themes of science fiction. It wasn't as popular, though, as things that would come later, like, for example, The Twilight Zone and Outer Limits. The Twilight Zone didn't necessarily deal just with science fiction stories or themes, but it did include a lot of episodes that were inspired or based upon science fiction stories. Two of the most famous ones that were produced between 59 and 64 were It's a Good Life and To Serve Man. And It's a Good Life was based upon a short story by Jerome Bixby that's in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. So it's regarded as one of the great science fiction short stories of the 1950s. And it's about a small town where we have this young boy who has the capacity to use his mind to affect physical results, including turning people into hideous comical figures or mentally transporting them into the cornfield. And he's very spoiled, and everybody in the village, all the adults, are terrified of him. And the line from the TV show is, "A monster has arrived in the village." And actually, the boy was played by Billy Mumy, who eventually, if I'm not mistaken, went on to play in Lost in Space. And at one point, he turned somebody into a clown that's on a spring that pops out of a box. And it's a very spooky story, because it's a story about a kid who has unlimited mental power, is spoiled, and turns the whole town into a bunch of terrified individuals. Stuck in my mind when I first saw the show. Years later, I read the story it was based on, and it was one of the better Twilight Zones that definitely had that came out of science fiction. Another one that people often remember from the Twilight Zone is To Serve Man, which is based on a story by Damon Knight, a very popular science fiction writer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up through there. And it's a story about a bunch of aliens who come to the Earth, and they offer trips in fact, it says here, episode 89, they offer trips to go to their home planet, and they give humanity a book, and the humans can only decipher the title of the book, and it says on the title in alien language, "To serve man." And it's only at the end of the story, as a few people who are the main characters in the story are getting on one of the spaceships to go to this planet, that they discover and realize that the book is a cookbook. And so it's got a real wallop at the end, based on a double meaning to serve man. And the aliens have come here to take us back to their planet so that they can cook us and eat us in various forms. And it's not the first time aliens have eaten humans, and it won't be the last. A third one that took a more serious approach to science fiction on TV was The Outer Limits. And probably lots of people remember from Outer Limits, the opening of it: "There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We're controlling transmission. You're about to participate in a great adventure. You're about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits." And that was on for 2 or 3 years. And I was an avid viewer of that. I'm sure a lot of the other people who are listening to this either watch the originals or watch reruns of The Outer Limits, which you could watch now on YouTube, and I probably could get them on Amazon as well. And Outer Limits had lots of strange and interesting characters. Special effects were not that great. One that stands out, and you maybe have other ones that stand out for you, is an episode where a number of scientists decide to transform a human into an alien through surgery, irreversible surgery, to try to frighten humanity to modify its warring ways, given the threat of aliens out in space. And then after that man has been modified to look like this really hideous creature, a farmer shoots and kills him. And it's a very kind of philosophical ending that, you know, we're going to try to help ourselves by frightening ourselves, and it doesn't work in the end. And there's one with Robert McCallum, which is of a human who evolves very quickly into a super intelligent and heartless being. And Terry mentioned the episode, I think it was the first episode, where an alien being that's energetic comes out of the TV set, which really just spook you. So these were rather serious efforts, but clearly science fiction in the 50s is taking off on TV and into the 60s. Now, again, there is the serious, and in this case, the absolutely goofy in the 50s and 60s. And the absolutely goofy came through with the Jetsons and Lost in Space. Now, I think Lost in Space, which is in the middle 1960s, at the beginning, perhaps intended to be serious, but it eventually got goofy. The Jetsons were always intended to be goofy, which came out a few years earlier. So we have envisioning this future world where people live in this super great high techno reality with robots and flying cars, and it's a comedy. And in Lost in Space, we have a group of humans who go on a spaceship to explore, I guess actually to go to another planet, but we have one character on board, Dr. Smith, who screws things up, and they end up lost in space and wandering around from one planet to another, encountering all kinds of ridiculous aliens along the way. And it becomes extremely funny. And in fact, it was Bill Mumy down there on the left-hand side who played the character in It's a Good Life on The Twilight Zone, and then became the young boy on Lost in Space. It is space exploration, like the Jetsons is futuristic, but in both cases, it's rather silly. They're both silly. But I watched both of them. I'm sure many of you watched them too. And it further helped to publicize to the general public visions of science fiction, whether it was future techno-enhanced realities or traveling through outer space and encountering aliens along the way. Lost in Space, in fact, even could be seen in some ways as another prelude to Star Trek, where Star Trek tried to attempt to become more serious than Lost in Space. In fact, Lost in Space and Star Trek both came out about the same time in the mid-1960s. So science fiction is coming through in these two things. And then, of course, now we will turn to the one that came out about the same time as Lost in Space, which was Star Trek. Now, as you note up there for Star Trek, the original series was on TV from 1966 to 1969. And I decided to include it in this module on the Silver Age because in a lot of ways, the themes covered, the characters, the plots had more the feeling of the Silver Age than of the new wave, which is to come next. And it's also a very powerful illustration of a point I've been highlighting repeatedly along the way here, which is how science fiction can impact popular culture, aside from reflecting it, but just impact it, not necessarily making prediction, but impacting it, having an influence on it, and actually generating fan organizations. Because after Star Trek went off the air in 1969, the phenomena of Trekkies and science fiction fandom began to emerge in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and Star Trek became a very powerful social phenomena with Star Trek conventions and people dressing up in Star Trek costumes and having the original members of the Star Trek TV show come to the conventions. It eventually instigated a whole series of later Star Trek TV series into the subsequent decades. And it created certain cultural icons. I think the one that was most powerful was Mr. Spock. But I also thought Star Trek was limited insofar as they envision humans in the 23rd century. Is that right? The 23rd century. Basically psychologically the same as humans today. So I didn't really see any psychological evolution projected 3 centuries out into the future, although there's a lot of techno evolution projected. There's even political evolution projected in that in the 23rd century, we have a united federation of planets. Now we still have bad guys, but now the bad guys are out there further away and not here on the Earth. The bad guys are the Klingon and the Romulans and other aliens that are further out. I would definitely suggest that Star Trek is a direct descendant of Hamilton's The Interstellar Patrol, for sure. And in ways, it's also off of Doc Smith too, but more Hamilton's Interstellar Patrol. What made Star Trek in part so significant was we have these memorable characters, the cast. So it wasn't just the technology and the outer space adventures. Everybody, of course, remembers the opening here, Space, the Final Frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations that are exploratory, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And that's a more classic golden age, silver age philosophy than the kinds of philosophical themes that come later with the new wave. So I'm putting it over here. It feels silver age to me, and it comes right at the tail end. I have up here some classic pictures because Star Trek did create a number of really excellent episodes and very memorable characters. I don't know if you know this, Star Trek actually had 2 pilots to begin with. And the first one was The Cage. And Captain Kirk isn't in the original pilot for Star Trek. And it was about these aliens who are down on the right-hand side there, who have the power to create virtual reality experiences and trap the captain of the Enterprise, who was played by, what's his name? It's on the tip of my tongue. It'll come back to me in a second. But the original captain, Captain Pike. Okay. And then they redid the pilot and did a second one with Captain Kirk as now the captain. And they redid Spock a little bit too, because in the original, there you see Spock with a 3-dimensional chess game to his right or left. And notice Spock doesn't quite look the same in the first original pilot as in this later on. But then they redo it and with Captain Kirk in it. And it's an episode called Where No Man Has Gone Before. And we have Sally Kellerman and what's his name? Gene Lockhart, something like that, who was also in 2001, right? Is that right? Yeah. Who become empowered by this incredible force that's drawing them outside of the Milky Way. We see the original Klingons, and notice that original Klingon there is nowhere near as ornate as the Klingons that come later. And we see the original Khan from the first series. And another very memorable episode, which won a Hugo, was The City at the Edge of Forever. And the screenplay, and this is the one that's down on the left side, the screenplay for the episode was written by Harlan Ellison. And as I mentioned, it won a Hugo Award. And it's about time travel. And Star Trek sometimes got interesting when it engaged in time travel. And in that episode, Kirk and Spock have to travel back to the 1930s to undo something that McCoy accidentally did back in the 1930s, because he went through the time portal first and changed history and have to undo it. But in order to undo it, Kirk has to allow this woman from the 1930s who is beautiful and admirable, and he's in love with her, he has to allow her to die. Because if she doesn't die, Hitler and the Nazis are going to win World War II. And so it's very heartfelt and philosophical. Star Trek sends its team out exploring, as they say in this opening, lots of different worlds, encountering lots of different aliens, sometimes superior to them, and attempting to make contact and not interfere with what they're doing if they're more primitive, and getting into challenges along the way on their exploration and encountering with various aliens out there in outer space. Now, Star Trek became a phenomenon, as I said, and it starts on TV, went into the movies, been plenty of Star Trek movies, and they're redoing them all again. And in fact, now they created a new timeline because they've had another time effect, time travel effect. So we have 2 different Spocks branching off in 2 different directions with 2 different timelines, and 2 different Captain Kirks as well too. So even though they're exploring space, they also get into exploring time and having time loop effects that occur in the process. So Star Trek is one of the most significant creations of that period, and it occurs on TV. Another one that occurs on TV that I'm nowhere near as familiar with is the longest running science fiction TV series, Doctor Who, which didn't come out of the United States, but came out of Great Britain. And just like Star Trek has its fandom, Doctor Who has its fandom. And Doctor Who, in fact, I think has gone through how many different Doctor Whos? I think 18 different actors have played Doctor Who over the last, 55 years here. It's still running now up to the present. And Doctor Who does get into a lot more time travel. And in the future, I will definitely do a lot more study into him because I never found them particularly fascinating. So I really don't have at this time a lot to say about Doctor Who, except it's the longest running TV series. It's been immensely popular. And so it does deserve some acknowledgement since it began in 1963, some acknowledgement as a significant element in the evolution of science fiction that takes us back to the Silver Age. Now, that's sort of just a bit of an overview of science fiction on TV. So we've covered science fiction in the movies, science fiction in magazines, just started a little bit with novels. Now, there's another visual dimension of science fiction, which I've always been very fascinated with. And I just want to close out today with a quick overview of this other dimension of science fiction that significantly evolved during the period. And that is science fiction art. Now here's that image again by Chesley Bonestell, a view of Saturn from Titan. And Chesley Bonestell was the father of modern space art and did incredibly good, very realistic visions, paintings of outer space, of spaceships, of planets and surfaces of planets you could see up there. Indeed, I just recently discovered that there is an Amazon show tracing the history and accomplishments of Chesley Bonestell. So if you get Amazon Prime, I would highly recommend watching the film. I think it's about an hour and a half in length, and it does go into significant depth as to the development and accomplishments of Chesley Bonestell. And he painted book covers and he painted magazine covers from the 1940s up through the 1970s. And he did the background art for Destination Moon. And he's the first of a number of significant artists of the 1950s, although as I mentioned, he was painting before and continued to paint afterwards. Now, a second one that's a significant artist of the period and expanding even further outward is Frank Kelly Freas. And Frank Kelly Freas is often referred to as the dean of science fiction artists. He's elected to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And I think I had mentioned in the past that people who produced significant accomplishments in science fiction have been elected. They could be novelists, they could be artists, they'd be connected with film, like Gene Roddenberry is a member, elected member of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And Kelly Freas is an artist, is an elected member. Kelly Freas does have the distinction of, in the early periods of the Hugo, as winning more Hugos as the best artist of the year than anyone else. He won 10 Hugo Awards for Best Artist of the Year between 55 and 76. And he did cover art for lots of books. Here we have some up here, including a very famous one, The Gulf Between, which was used later on the cover of a rock album. I forget who was it that did the rock album with that cover on it. And there's a cover there of from Who, of the man with the metal mask on, and some various other images of aliens and provocative women. Now, although Freas was, as I mentioned, highly regarded, highly awarded, there were other artists that I feel were actually more inventive and powerful and interesting than Freas during the 40s, 50s, and 60s up through that time. And one who is very fascinating Ed Emshwiller. And he won the Hugo 4 times as best science fiction artist of the year. And he's also a member of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And his stuff, if you look at the sampling up here, is colorful and shocking and artistically creative in ways that I think go beyond freeze. And so some of these images are very, I think, are very impressive. And he did a lot of cover art as well too for science fiction novels and science fiction magazines. Now, to come to a third person, a third artist of the period, who very much impressed me. I think this is not just simply a great work of science fiction art. I think this is a great work of art. And this is by Hannes Bach, whose real name was Wayne Woodard. And Hannes Bach is actually derivative from Johann Sebastian Bach. That's the name he gave himself. And this is the cover that he did for fantasy and science fiction for A Rose for Ecclesiastes. And notice that it has almost an El Greco kind of style to it, and it's very vivid and very colorful. And Bach was a member of the Futurians. He was a student and a friend and inspired by Maxfield Parrish, who was a contemporary great American artist. Bach did a whole slew of magazine covers. He was friends with Ray Bradbury, who got him into the science fiction community. He did stuff for Weird Tales. He also won a Hugo as best cover artist. And he was a kind of strange character, which Forrest Ackerman described as he starved to death. He only lived to be 50, and he was mystical and reclusive. Now, this is one of his paintings, which I feel is very powerful, very dramatic, very innovative. But just to give you a feel, here's a number of his other paintings. This is from another book cover. His cover for The House on the Borderland, which is up there on the right side, is a very dramatic picture. He also did drawings in black and white. You could see some of his work in that dimension, which are very surrealistic with elements of what I want to call it, design art to them. And a very, very unique, impressive artist of that time, and did a lot of covers for lots of science fiction magazines. Now we'll come to another one. Notice there's just this slew of great science fiction artists who appear here, clearly transcending the kind of stuff that Frank Paul did back in the 1920s and 30s. And the next one is also in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Virgil Finlay, also won Hugo for Best Science Fiction Artist of the Year. And Finlay primarily did his art in ink and very detailed compositions. Lots of naked women, lots of ethereal, cosmic kinds of scenes, lots of beauty and grace, but also strangeness. Notice some of the aliens that are up there too. I would think that in his own distinctive way, Finlay comes as close to being cosmic in his imagery, even when he's painting something just like a woman with stars around her. It has this dreamlike quality. That woman there that's sitting on the base that has the pointed ears and claws in the end of her hands, that's his drawing for H.G. Wells' The Time Machine and the Sphinx in The Time Machine from 800,000 AD. And he was nominated for the Hugo for Best Artist a whole number of times back in the 1940s up through the 1950s. he's definitely one of my favorite artists and one of the most popular science fiction artists of the Silver Age, but transcending just the Silver Age. And you can't really do justice to appreciating the visual intensity and artistic quality and strangeness of his stuff, except to see them in bigger pictures. And there's several books out of Finley's art which you could buy, or go look at it on the web. There's tons of it up on the web. Now we come to somebody who is clearly getting toward the surrealistic and abstract, Paul Lear. And Paul Lear painted hundreds of covers for science fiction novels back in the 1950s and 1960s, hundreds of them. In fact, somebody has said that Lear dominated science fiction covers, novel covers. And Lear has a very unique style because it's not realistic, but it definitely is kind of outer spacey, and it has strange different forms in it. He's got super saturated colors in it. And as I mentioned, was very popular during the 1950s and 1960s. And then we come to the person who is often seen as the most innovative of science fiction artists of the period that I've been talking about. And that is Richard Powers. And Richard Powers goes beyond the standard science fiction kind of artist. Because if you look at his paintings, you'll see, number one, he's surrealistic. Number two, if you know him, he reminds you of Yves Tanguy, who was a surrealist painter of the earlier part of the 20th century, or Salvatore Dali. He did not do representational art. He did these images of strange and bizarre shapes. And he did a ton of it. And he was extremely popular, maybe a couple hundred science fiction book covers he did back in that period. And there's several books you could buy of his stuff. A very distinctive kind of artist, because a lot of science fiction artists, even if they were attempting to be way out and cosmic and spacey, Powers assimilates non-representational art into his style. He reflects the kinds of art that was produced by the post-representational artists, and he puts it into his paintings. So we'll find lots of other science fiction artists later on who do that too, but Powers is the one who does that first and does that most dramatically. And Powers is elected to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame as well. So that's just a bit of an overview of a flavor of the evolution of visualization that went on in science fiction through art, through the movies, through TV, during the Silver Age. Now, we're probably at a good spot to stop, because the second 2 hours, we're going to talk more about all of the various science fiction authors that come on the scene. And we're going to start with Heinlein and Asimov, who are veterans of the Golden Age and continue to write into the Silver Age. And then we'll bring up Sturgeon and Fritz Lieber, who start in the Golden Age, but continue into the Silver Age, and Cornwainer Smith, and then other people who I haven't even mentioned yet that much, all the way up through Philip Dick toward the latter part of the 1960s. So that's a good place to stop for right now.